Welcome to Marathon Champions, the podcast where running legends Benji Durden, Bill Rogers, and Ron Tabb share their timeless wisdom on marathon training and inspire listeners with their wealth of experience. These champions continue to impact the running world today. Now, let's pass the mic to your MC, Letty Lundquist, to kick off this journey of enduring inspiration.
Welcome to episode 2 of the podcast Marathon Champions. My name is Letty Lundquist. I've also been the longtime host of my own podcast, the Marathon Running Podcast, and I'm back with the three amigos, the three legends, Benji Durden, Bill Rogers, and Ron Tabb, to record a second episode of their podcast where we talk about the Olympic trials then and now.
I mean, Benji, Letty, Ron, taking a look at world athletics and the qualifying for the Olympic trials. Wow. Does it seem to you like this is a fiasco? The way they weren't quite sure what the heck they were doing? I mean, it was so much easier years ago. It was not complicated. Now it's, I don't know what it is.
I know one of the organizers. Yeah, I know one of the organizers for the Orlando trials, and he called me 2 weeks ago after they made the announcement that they were going to cave in and change the starting time. And, you know, they had already, it's pretty, he was explaining how difficult it was to make that adjustment for the TV considerations. So it's ended up.
Ron, do you think, Ron, Benji, Annie, Letty, that USA Track and Field, let's face it, it's always been a bifurcated sport. You know, there's the distance running, cross country, marathon side, road side, and then there's athletics, pole vault, shot put, and so forth. And I love them all, but I don't think there's ever been too much of an understanding of athletes' concerns. Of course, back in our days when we ran the trials, there wasn't even a discussion about the heat, and we had no power whatsoever. So I'm glad that was changed, and hopefully it will lead USA Track and Field to consider the athletes' concerns a little earlier in the process.
Yeah, and with the listeners being kind of more on my level, that we don't really know how everything works. There's a lot of confusion going on about how this Olympic trial process is working. We know that women at this point have to run a 2:37 and men have to run a 2:18. And that's pretty much where it ends. So when you see events like last weekend where CJ Albertsons ran a second marathon in order to lock in a time, and then we look at the time and it's off the time for the standard Olympics, it gets even more confusing. So perhaps we can start with explaining how this all works.
Yes, that's a good point, Letty. And I think Benji and Ron probably can speak a little more clearly than I can about this.
Clarity is not something that's that easy to do. So we've been told now that we have two Americans on a legitimate course that's acceptable for times have run the Olympic standard by time, which is 2:08:10, I believe it is. And so we have two that, if we stopped right now, we didn't even have the trials, we could send those two. Then there was some confusion initially that said, okay, we have to have a third person do that at the trials if they want to go. Well, that may be what they thought. I don't know. But then now they're saying if you have run under 2:11:30 on a course that's acceptable for time, they'll consider you part of the team. However, that doesn't mean you get to go. You have to be that 2:08:10 or I think it's 64, it might be 65. There's a points system too. And you have to be one of the top, 64, 65 runners with the ranked that way.
In the world, Benji.
In the world, but it's not, 15 Kenyans. It's 3 Kenyans, 3 Ethiopians, they say, okay, these are the teams, and they count down. And so we have a couple of people hovering around that number. So CJ, he's now could be considered an Olympian if he finishes in the top 3, because he's got the 211, sub 211.30. And he did that by running the second race, because California International is a point to point, and it's considered aided. And because it's considered aided, it wouldn't count. But he might not get to go, because I don't think he's ranked that highly. He's probably in the top.
Yeah, that was what I was. Yeah, that was what I was saying. We had, and I'm going to go back to when we looked at the 2000 Olympics. We had one representative on the men's side, one representative on the women's side, who were the only ones who met the Olympic qualifying standards. So therefore, we only had one American representative in the marathon in Sydney in 2000. So it falls along the same lines as what happened in 2000, where right now we have the women have qualified. They've met the Olympic qualifying standard. But as it stands today, if we were to send our team to Paris next week, we would only have 2 men that are certain to be representing the United States.
And what about the women's side?
Well, yeah, Ron just kind of semi-referred to that, saying we have, plenty of women. In fact, the women, it's not even an issue. I think we have maybe as many as 12 who've got the Olympic time standard, and I think we have more than that possibly that will meet the point standard. I just pulled up the rankings by points. I'm going to have to do some math to figure out. Connor Mance, who's our top runner, is 66 on the list. But that doesn't mean he's really 66, because I've got to go through here and pull out, all the Ethiopians that are ahead of him, all the Kenyans that are ahead of him, except for, 3. You get down, Leonard Langat is, I think, the next one after Connor and his training buddy. Maybe not. I don't know. His training buddy, even though he's got the time, he doesn't have the standard. And the way the point standard works is based on who you've run against, the races you've run. I mean, Leonard Langat is, I think, a 211, maybe 210. He did. Let me see here. I'd be able to tell by clicking on. No, he's.
So the question would be, though.
Yeah, go ahead.
So the question would be, even if you're ranked in the top 64, top 65,
right,
and you haven't met the Olympic qualifying standard, that still doesn't entitle you a position on the Olympic. You could be a U.S. Olympian.
No, you if you're ranked in the top 65, you get to go. If your country wants to send you. It's a point system. New York gets a bunch of points. Boston gets a bunch of points. Chicago gets a bunch of points. And we were talking, about, one of our conversations amongst ourselves about the fact that they're gold level races. There's silver level races. Essentially it's an intention. The intention here is to get you to run important races as opposed to just running races. So they want athletes to compete in the races they want athletes to compete in. It used to be, back in the days when Frank and Billy were, knocking heads out there, that you couldn't just up and go to Europe and run races. You had to get permission from the governing body to go run races. Now we can go and run races wherever we want, pretty much, if we can get a visa in the country. But if they're still trying to put pressure on us to run the races they want us to run by saying, okay, here's the races where you get points. And the points are one way to get into the games. And it's world championships as well. That's another way. Or you can get in by time. So they've got both, and the time standards have gotten very stringent. Yeah, Letty.
So now that you're talking about the point system, is a person that is younger, for example, look at Conor Munson, his age, and Eliud Kipchoge, pretend they're from the same country. Obviously, Kipchoge has a lot more under his belt. How does that play out with the point system and the lack of points, so to speak?
Well, the points get scrubbed at the end of each competitive cycle. So it doesn't matter what Kipchoge did 2 years ago or 3 years ago, whenever. I don't know how long the points table is good for, but it gets scrubbed and you have to start over again.
Okay. And then another question that comes up with that is, do you think it would be possible that the USATF would send men based on a different selection process than the women that already have a deep field of people qualifying under the Olympic standard?
Well, let's say we get 3 women and one of the women doesn't run the time, which is, I think, unlikely, because I think they'll be able to get the time even if they, I think the women's race will likely be run fast enough that all 3 will have the time. But let's say they don't. Then they would have to make a decision about, can we send, and she's not in the top 65, she probably wouldn't get to go. They might not send a third person. They might just send 2. We've had that situation where we've had, on the track, I think there was a time when we had like 5 1,500-meter runners that had the time, but they did not do well at all. 2 or 3 of them did not do well at all at the trials. So there used to be, you had a window after the trials to try to get a time. That doesn't happen anymore. The track, there may be a small window, but it's a pretty small window. If you're 10,000, you don't have the time and you don't have the ranks, you don't go. So, whereas the men, I don't know. I mean, we've got what their official statement is, but let's say Conor Mantz doesn't make the top 3. Do we still send him? If we, because we felt in Atlanta that nobody was going to get the time there, and everybody basically did. The time wasn't quite as severe, but everybody basically did. So let's say we don't get, because I'm not expecting a sub 209 at Orlando. I could be wrong. I can't, these days with the new shoes, I can't make predictions anymore, have any clue what I'm talking about. But let's say we don't have a sub 209. We have 3 guys run 209, 10, 11, and 12. And Conor Mantz isn't in there. Now what do we do?
I think there's an issue also, what if we go back to 20 years ago, we only have 1 American man, 1 American woman. I think Americans tuning in to the Olympic Games like to see Americans. And maybe SEBCO and World Athletics should take a look at this. And also there's another interesting story here, which is that where we got our PRs, Ron, Benji, and myself, was at Boston. It is considered an aided course, which is fantastically interesting because some very fine marathoners totally folded their cards there, including
I did my career there. I ran fast, and that was in. The problem is, and I've come out from both directions because I've done course measurement and I understand the process. Boston is technically aided because it's point to point, which allows for wind aid, and it has a negative, more than, I think it's 3 meters per kilometer or whatever. It might even be less than that. It might be 2 meters, whatever. And the thought process when they came up with this was to try to, make it fair that, you don't want the St. George's of the world to be where people are selected. And how do you come up with something to say, okay, Boston's a cruel course? It is. It's a really cruel course. Even though technically it's aided, it's a cruel course. It beats the crap out of you in all kinds of ways. But how do you come up with a subjective measure for something like that?
Do you think the selectors,
objective measure?
Maybe if the selectors ran the course, they could understand.
Well, but again, you got to have something that you can objectify mathematically with physics or something like that, and say, because we know Boston there should be a Boston exception, maybe. But if you say there's a Boston exception, then you say, okay, you come up with this other course. You do one of the Revel runs.
My point is the difference between Boston and St. George is Boston has hills you must climb, and quite a few of them. And I think some well-known athletes have discovered that. And,
Kipchoge being one.
Yeah, and I think the real story behind this is also USA Track and Field used to make big money at Boston by requiring everyone who ran the Boston Marathon to pay a fee to USA Track and Field. I think it was $35 a year.
Well, it started off as
the head of Hancock. Once USA Track and Field said we're not going to let Boston qualify as a race, a significant race, which is hilarious. Hancock, Dave D'Alessandro, the leader of Hancock, said, "Well, we're not giving you the 15,000 times $35 they used to charge people. You used to rip people off. I mean, come on, USA Track and Field."
It wasn't quite that much money, but it was a lot. I mean, the last year's USATF fee, I think it was 24, and they've just raised it to 58, which is, what do you get for that $58? I guess if you're an elite athlete, you get to run in the nationals. We should probably move on, though. We've already spent a bit of time rambling. Yeah. I guess we also wanted to talk. I mean, maybe we're just going to get, this podcast will be just about the Olympic.
One of the things we didn't address, though, is I don't think that, for our listening audience, Boston would not qualify. That is not one of the qualifying races.
Right. You have to be a record quality course, and record quality courses have to have a separation of about 30%. So I think like if you're a 10K, your start and finish have to be within about 3K of each other. And you can only have a drop of about, I want to say it's 2 meters per kilometer.
Yeah. Well, I think what we're saying, though, is it's a shame that the marathon that is so well known.
It's a shame, but it's just, again, as I was saying.
I understand the reason. It's just it's a shame, though, that they have basically taken Boston and kind of put it to the side.
Well, but again, it's not about Boston. Boston just falls into the category. It wasn't designed for Boston. Yeah. It was designed for the Revel runs and the St. George's and the races where, I actually was involved in a lawsuit a long time ago where somebody was, I don't remember exactly the point of the lawsuit, but somebody ran really well at one race and ran poorly at another. And St. George was one of the really good races. And it was about a 25-minute differential. And so at some point you have to ask yourself, is this fair? But anyway, let's don't go off down that rabbit hole. Does anybody have predictions?
Point? I know that Amby Burfoot has investigated the new fast courses, like Valencia and Berlin and London.
Oh yeah, and now that's a different idea altogether, where you have a course that's so fast and yet legal.
They're accepted. Yeah,
they're accepted, and I don't know why they're so fast.
I think this is all about selling shoes.
Well, there's certainly the only reason we actually made a living doing what we're doing is because basically we sold shoes.
That's true. But also, I think there is the Olympic ideal.
But I don't know how long the Olympic ideal has been dead, but it's pretty much dead.
No, don't say that.
So Bill, how would you like to have had be in this position in 1976 when you made the Olympic team and actually competed in the Olympics? How would you like to be in the position or how would you like to have been in this position 40 years, almost 50 years ago now, where you're going, I don't know if I'm on the team or not. You think about it, it's crazy that you think that, maybe 50 years ago, you're in the same position that Conor Mantz is in today.
Well, Connor's not, Connor's in the same position that I was in 80 and Bill was in 76, the trials have not been run. He's got a good time, but the trials have not been run. I mean, Jeff Wells had a better time than me going into 1980. I was not picked to be in the top 3. I mean, you can't, just because you've run a fast marathon in the last year doesn't mean you're on the team. You still have to go and I personally think that
that's actually, it's another topic too, because some countries don't run a trials. They have they select their teams based on on their
this
performance.
This is a money maker for who.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I mean, you've got, how many we have, how many men have qualified this year for the trials and how many women? And how many?
A lot. I go get the number, but it's a big number.
But it's a huge number. But really, there's only, on the women's side, maybe 15 that have a legitimate shot of making the team. On the men's side, you have maybe 4 or 5.
On paper, we got
on paper. I know. I mean, we know that things happen, but when you look at it, would it be a better situation to go, okay, based on your performances over the last year and a half or so, we're going to select our team?
Well, we did that. We used to do that. That was back in 1968.
In before us, yeah.
Yeah, in 1968 was our first single race trials. Before that, you had to run 2 or 3 other races, and they were some pretty brutal races. And we had a decent performance occasionally, but it's a lot more given the size of, we got close to 200 men and women that have qualified. And that means that there's that many people are quality performers, and they should have an opportunity to all get together and decide which one of them are going to perform on the day. I don't think it's fair for us to just say, like the British approach is pretty much a selection. They maybe say, okay, you get this race, and if you do well, that's one. Well, the Japanese the same way. The Japanese, they had like 3 or 4 races that you had to do really well at, and then even so, you didn't know for a fact that except the last one, there was a time standard you had to run. It was something like 2:05 that you had to run under to be sure of making the team. And so you get that last race and the weather's bad, you're screwed. I prefer the way we've done it since 68, which is the first 3 are on the team.
And I agree.
You get to go because that's World Athletics. We didn't come up with this rule. The World Athletics did.
Yeah, but it's also...
It would be interesting, Ron, Benji, Letty, to know how many countries select their field based on your performance the previous year. Let's say Scott Fauble's the fastest American, and he did it at Boston and everything. Well, we all know how tricky Boston is. If you don't know it, I recommend you try the Boston Marathon so you can learn it. And so I think that would be interesting, don't you think? I also think, why are they packing half marathon into the marathon trials? Come on. Even though there's only 15 women and 7 guys who are half marathon and getting in.
I agree with you. We've had 2 medalists in the last 2 games that came from the half marathon.
Molly Seidel was one, and who was?
I think Galen got in with the half.
Galen got in LA. Yeah. Galen had not run a marathon before LA.
Yeah.
Oh, I thought he ran. Oh, at LA.
LA is where he ran his first marathon to make the team. And then he medaled, didn't he? Or was he 4?
Yeah, he medaled.
He medaled, yeah.
He got a silver in Rio.
Yeah. So I at the time I felt like this isn't right, but it turns out that we picked 2 medals.
I had an issue with that as well. I thought that, you should and I think now isn't there 10K you can use to get your qualifying time for the trials?
No, the 10K, I think.
But I mean,
the 10K. You look at the USATF page, and there's nothing about 10K. The thing that I saw, because the 10K is a difficult one to get into, and you're placing at the World Cross Country. can apply to the 10K rankings. Which, but yeah.
Well, it's going to be an exciting race.
Start wrapping up our Olympic trials segment here with some. Does anybody have any clue who's going to make the team?
Well, let's put some guesses out there, right? I'm going to guess Connor Muntz, and I'm going to hope for CJ Albertson, because for whatever reason, I like how he speaks during his interviews. So I'm hoping that those two will be on there.
I think Connor's a pretty good guess. CJ, I think, is not as good when he's against a bunch of other guys that are his level. He's pretty good at winning races by himself. He's pretty good at running. I don't think he has the tactics down yet. I think that's his biggest issue.
And Galen is a possibility again, which is really
Galen. You can't really, not predict him because he's been there, but he's not the Galen we used to see. I'm thinking it's possible that Scott Fauble might be able to sneak in. A real dark horse. Let's see. Here's.
I think Scott Fauble is more of a person who likes Boston. Let's face it, he's been the top men's marathoner, American guy at Boston for a number of years. He's a 2:08 guy. He's done that several times. I think he's going to be in the hunt, but in particular, if it is hot and or humid in Florida.
Yeah, I'm going to go out and say Parker Stinson, since he's from Boulder. He's not yet raced the entire marathon. He's run based on, I've talked to him a bit. He's gone and just ran easy and then pushed at the end. So there's a possibility. I think it's probably a really dark horse, but that's my dark horse. Let's look
I was just stunned by how much quality there is. How many guys have run 2:09? Now, I know the new shoes and the new courses, I think. Not too many have been set at Boston. I think the BAA's fellow who's run 2:09.
I forgot about him.
Yeah, he's a real contender. But I think this is a pancake course. What is Paris like? Do they have some bridges?
Paris is hilly. Paris is very hilly.
Yeah. So that's going to be the deal. And it might be a little bit warm. So this is what we're looking at.
I've talked to Gary Cohen, who's part of the committee. He's looked up the temperatures for that time of day over history, and he says that 30% of the time it's in the 60s, 30% of the time it's in the 70s, and 30% of the time it's in the 80s, and the remaining 10% is outside those ranges.
Are you talking at start time in Paris?
No, we're talking Orlando.
Orlando.
Paris is going to be hot. I mean, I almost guarantee Paris is going to be hot. It may not be extremely hot, but it's going to be hot.
Do you remember our trials? You didn't run 76, Benji?
I wanted to. I started running marathons, trying to get a qualifying standard.
Yeah.
223. And I just didn't do it. I ran 236 and then a 237, and then it was too late. But
you had a very strange start into your marathoning. But Ron, didn't you run the 76 trials, or you weren't there?
No, my coach at Central. I was down at college, and our assistant coach at Central Missouri, he was actually 11th in the trials, and I considered taking the year off to try and qualify for the trials, and my coaches talked me out of it. They didn't want me to interfere with. It would have interfered with my cross country and track season if I'd have done that, and they didn't want that to happen. So, but yeah, I started having thoughts of trying to run the trials, at that far back. So, another thing we're kind of, the three of us that, we've had our own experiences with the trials, and Bill, you in the Olympics. But one of the interesting things is what we did back in the 70s and the 80s, it would still be relative today based on what we did almost 50 years ago, 40 years ago. Our times are still competitive. And, we would, I think we would be in the mix of possibly making a team. Because Bill, I know 208 to you back then seemed very feasible. Benji, I think, we've had the conversation before. We both felt like that we were capable of running. I felt like I was capable of running 207 back in, during that early.
Well, Ron, what do you think? Do you think the shoes, we didn't have those shoes that all the pros wear today, and many
Right.
of the non-pros were trying to become pros, perhaps. So that might have given us a little extra time. I don't know. We can't really know where we sit today, but I think you had to deal with what you had to deal with. But I think that in a certain sense that's true. But I think the knowledge of training is higher today. The coaching is higher and higher level. I think we were kind of, I don't know what we were. We were flukes a little bit. We were lucky too, that we made it to the Olympic trials and competing in the Olympic teams. And so I think we do know a lot about the sport, but I don't know.
I agree kind of with both of you. I mean, I do think we'd still potentially have been competitive if we could, if I was suddenly 25 again and know what I know and have the opportunities that are there today, who knows? But that's not the way it is. But we haven't talked about the women. So what do you guys think about the women's team?
Well, I have my guesses. I think we saw Seidel and Emma Bates and Sarah Hall run really well last year. Alafine Tuliamuk told me she's going to run the trials. And so she might be a factor again, but I think those, the thing is, with Emma Bates, she ran 2:22 at Boston. That was a phenomenal effort. As Boston Marathons goes, that's, Desi ran 2:22 there. Joan ran 2:22 at Boston on that wonderful day of 1983. Benji, which you remember so well when you annihilated your foot in a duel with Mr. Greg Meyer. I think it's going to be they're both going to be fantastic to watch. And let's always cheer for the American athletes because I think it's going to be interesting in Paris too. But I don't know. What do you think, Ron, Letty, Benji? What information can we give to the viewers who might be listening to our podcast now?
Well, from Emma Bates, unfortunately, she seems to have a plantar tear and shin splints right now that she's dealing with. So not sure how, that'll be at that time. It seems like plantar fasciitis creeps up and stays for a long time.
Yeah, it does. That was the shin splints, no, but the plantar fascia tear is what ended my elite career. Molly just ran well at a hot 10K in Honolulu and won that easily. So she's rounding into shape. We can't forget about the fact that Emily Sisson, our American record holder, looked pretty much in control setting that American record.
Yes.
So I think she's unless something bad happens, she's a highly
should be there.
Yeah.
And Kira D'Amato, I think Sarah Hall has been pushing hard. You got to remember, she ran 2:25 at Boston this year. That's worth 2:23 at Chicago or Berlin or London. I don't care what anyone says. And she,
yeah. But
so I think she's
age is beginning to be a factor for her.
It's going to be who's healthy on the line.
Yeah.
The same story.
Sarah Vaughn is dropping times rapidly. She ran 2:23 in Chicago. So I kind of, she's sort of a personal favorite.
There's always one upset athlete. There's two real well-known, they've proven themselves, and then there's one who makes their mark and has their day, sort of. But the injury thing, Letty, I'm not sure how you learn that, but I think athletes hide their injuries and the coaches hide them because they're hoping and hoping and hoping. But we know there's some people are not going to be on the line in Florida.
Oh, yeah. There's going to be a few that don't make it and a few that make it, but they're not 100%. And The part of the difficulty of making predictions is so few races are run. You don't really know. There's no scouting report. You have no really good way of knowing who's fit and ready to go.
When you talked about injuries, this sport is so tricky. To be consistent and produce the goods year after year is a great, great challenge. Emily Sisson's doing that. Kira D'Amato too, but so has Sarah Hall. And I got to take my hat off to her because she's 40 years old, I think now, of course. Yeah. And and she's kept her eye on the ball. But I think one of the main difference between us and those runners who are getting on the line in Orlando is they're all up at altitude. I wasn't at altitude, and I think I did talk with Rob DiCostella, the great Australian marathoner, and he told me he doesn't think it means that much to go up to altitude. Maybe to be born at altitude is the big factor.
We'll talk about that in another, altitude in general in another podcast. But yeah, so okay. I think maybe we should draw this one to a close and see what happens. I mean,
okay, this German.
So we'll call this a day, and we'll have another podcast where we talk about environmental conditions.
Go USA.
We hope that you enjoyed what you heard. And if you like what you heard, be sure to subscribe and share. And your support means everything. And until next time, embrace the journey and take care. Happy listening.